Hello, everybody. We have a few things to go over today. The list is only like that long, but it'll take a minute to go over it. This is about the time I was hoping to start getting ahead on the lectures. Here as we finish up week 4, that all that slow talking the first day, of course, policies and stuff, and it stretches out. And then since then, we've been kind of running the lecture right before the homework's due. So hopefully we'll get up to media queries, which is the last thing that'll be the homework that's due on Wednesday. But if necessary, I can push that back since we're covering it right before that. But also, that one's pretty easy. So the book covers it thoroughly, but I still like to cover it in class. And if we run out of time today or it seems rushed to get that in the homework by Wednesday, I can push that date back. I'm not too worried about that. We still got a little bit of time this semester. And then by the end of this week, we should be like a lecture ahead, at least a day ahead of when the homework's due. So we'll do like talking on Monday and Wednesday, and then that's the stuff that'll show up on the homework due the following Wednesday. And we're rushing to do stuff, so. But there's a bunch of much more useful things to talk about first, which is our layups. And look at a few points on those. As always, this is an active subject. So I'm gonna try to leave lots of time to do stuff at the end. Before we get started, I did want to sort of make an announcement or say something about this. There's usually some gamers in every class. And I don't know if you knew this or not, Ivy Tech does have an esports team, which does kind of transition who's on it semester to semester. But one of the professors up at Fort Wayne sent an email out over the weekend wanting to challenge other campuses to an esports event. So anybody that's a gamer, please make sure and let me know that if you're interested in that. It can be a whole lot of fun. Probably not a commute thing, like be virtual, and in the past when it was done that way, we could run like have our team here on campus, where you have really good Wi-Fi or really good connectivity, especially on like a Friday when campus is almost empty, and the people playing the game are the only ones using the internet connection set up for the number of people that would typically be at a campus to get really good connection rates and stuff. But if any gamers are interested in that, please make sure you let me know within the next couple days, and I will send him some availability times. Just make sure I get your school email, but if you're in one of my classes, I know that. And my thing is, when would be good times to do it? It's probably going to be close to the end of the semester, I'm guessing. Maybe the mid-April is. No dates have been talked about yet, but since he just sent that out over the weekend saying Fort Wayne wants to challenge other campuses to some esports events, and if possible, even do like a daily scrimmage. All the campuses are there at once, competing against each other. So it'll take a few days to put that, a little while to put that together. My tentative guess on when we'll look for is like mid-April, towards the end of the semester. But if you're a gamer interested in doing the esports stuff, just make sure and let me know, including what times, some availability times and stuff. At least a rough idea. We're in the early planning stages, but at least want to get a census of who would be on a team this semester. Yeah, that's kind of the only announcement. So, moving on to some of this other stuff. Okay, a couple sets of notes to look at today. Once again, it's one of those days where there's a bunch of random tools we need to look at, so we can start applying them when we make web pages. But they're not necessarily things to go together, or this first set of notes in my hand here is all alternatives. Yeah, several alternatives to achieve the same results. So thus far, we've kind of just stacked things on a page, right? Of this web page, and we just start up at the top, put something there. The markers, good. And then the next thing goes right below it, over at the left side of the page. Next thing goes right below that. Next thing right below that. And you all kind of know where, can see where that's going. Probably want to adjust that a little bit better, make things look lay out on the page kind of nicely. Like you have that essay assignment that's due by the end of the semester, which is really to kind of make it look like a page. So like your screen would have all this area out here, and you'd have the white spot with maybe a little shadow behind it. So with the words get put on there, it looks like a piece of paper. In which case we'd want to set some stuff. Was that some stuff way up there for like the page numbers and the headers? There are a few things real small over here. Lay out the boxes that way. Or to avoid drawing a picture. In other instances, we might want a couple things set up in columns. And scatter things around the page with a little bit more control. The layout on the page. And we have lots of properties in our CSS for controlling that. Let's start with the easiest way to make a couple columns, which is basically if they're narrow enough, the browser will put them left or right. So instead of putting all that lorem ipsum stuff, I'm just going to put random words, very random words. I'll go ahead and share my screen here and kind of get started with a simplified example. Oh, once the text editor opens, I guess I could have opened that before class. There we go. So let's see. It's going to be a project. We'll have more than one file. What's that message about? Oh, whatever that message was, it went away. A new folder. I'll call it Valentine's. It's a good day name to uniquely identify this one. There we go. So we got our project set up. So now we just need some files to go in it. And as always, start with an HTML file. There's a lot that's always consistent. So most text editors know that base part. Or it wouldn't take you long to set up type that much as your starting template. Then you just open that file and save it under a different name every time you need page. There's some sort of basic stuff. I'm going to take out the direction tag. That's kind of what we're looking at here. We're going to do things a little bit different. I think I'll just do one page that has a bunch of sections that we do a different type of layout for each one. No, we're not constantly creating a bunch of different pages. So I'll put in a main tag. Main tag, and I'll give it the ID floats. So good starting one. Come down a couple lines and close that. And then I'll put 3 sections in it. Section class equals float top. In that section, and another section with the class of float middle, or no, float right. Yeah, I need to do left and right. Section with the class name of float right or left. Which one did I do the first time? Float right. And one more section tag with a class name of float bottom. So I'm gonna put some paragraphs in them, just completely random words. But from those names, I think you probably have an idea of what sort of wireframe I was looking at, or what the wireframe I have in mind here would look like. I'll erase this one. So for our floats, we'll put like a header up at the top, some sort of column on the left, a column on the right, and then something that spans both columns at the bottom. Something like that for the wireframe. Oh, that marker looks like it's going to give out on me too. I only brought 3 in here with me. If it gets too dim, I'll just run back over to the office. My office is just right across the hall. So that'll be our first little way to lay out the words. Put things in columns. We can fit more information in columns, is the advantage of doing that. If you never sit down and actually check like how many words fit on a page, flowing top to bottom, or how many words fit on a page with 2 columns in the same amount of space. We can fit more information there, and when a human glances at it, it looks like less reading because each column's only that wide as opposed to being the width of the whole page. So our instincts tell us it's less to read, but there's more that fits in the columns. Let's see. So for up top, I'll just put a header. Floating stuff. And then just a couple paragraphs. Here are some words. The words are not important here. I'm not sure which one it is. There's usually a duplicate function where you can put your cursor at the end of the line, but I don't know what it is on this one. So Control-Shift-D. Might be different in your text editor, but something that happens a lot when programming is a lot of lines that are very, very similar to the one above. They go in order. I often like to point out that whenever we have those almost identical lines, it's better to work vertically down the columns have to change our mindset as often as we work on it. So whenever we do have that, your text editor should have something for duplicate lines. I know in Notepad++, it's just Control D. It looks like an atom here where I'm working, it's Control Shift D. So to do that, you just put your cursor at the end of the line and hit that keyboard shortcut. Duplicate it a couple times, and the words really don't matter on this. What we're gonna do is layout stuff, so I'll just copy and paste that whole thing over there. Here I want a longer line. We're gonna have this line is long enough to be certain that it does spread between the multiple columns above it on the page. So once again, the words aren't important. They all turn word wrap on to make that easier to read. Hopefully that's long enough to spread across, be longer than any of the columns above it. So we'll be able to tell that it stretches across. Just some random words to make it long enough for that. And whenever you have those long lines, turn toggling word wrap on. So that's something you might want to figure out the keyboard shortcut. If there's a keyboard shortcut on your text editor, on Atom here, there's not a keyboard shortcut for it. But it can be really useful to turn that on and off because it's easier to code if the line just feeds off to the right for however long the computer will let it. Then we can line our one instruction per line up. But that gets really hard to read, so it's nice to turn the word wrap on and make sure we have the right data on our page. So that's just a long line, and I guess we can open this and check for obvious typos before we get into the CSS part. Okay, so nothing really seems too fancy there. That's what we've seen before. I already erased that example from the board, but we've seen that. Things just start at the left. That element takes up, well, it actually goes over the whole line. If I hover over it and inspect with the inspector. Oh, whoops, turn off the emulator. Turn off the emulator so it looks like a laptop computer. And hover over that stuff, you can see that each element does take up that whole line. Once I get stuff out of my way, there we go. This one. And so that element takes up the whole line. So then for the line below it, or section below it, and then each of the section paragraphs in there, it takes up the whole line. So then the next one obviously has to go on the line below it. So your first thought might be that, well, maybe if we just made that narrower in our style sheet, it would help. So I'll go ahead and set up a style sheet, come back up to the head section. Link, there's something I'm hoping to talk about with links today. We'll see here in a little while. We'll do it in the anchor tag, but that's a distraction. Oh, my source. Relevance is style sheet. And the hyperlink reference to it is, I don't know, vday.style.css. Just some unique name. Then the MIME type is a good thing to practice here, but we've seen that a few times. And HTML5 does have a standard, so we know what the MIME type is supposed to be here. So we don't necessarily have to explicitly state that one. But we do need to go create that file. vday.css. A whole bunch of stuff we've seen before, right? nothing fancy yet. If we come over here. Yeah, I have the example pulled up from 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago when I taught this, 2 or 3 years ago when I taught this, it went really, really well. But then I know last year I made some changes and kind of tried to throw in way too much for a hour-and-a-half long lecture. So making sure I pull up the example from 2 years ago so I don't try to so I don't get carried away with details that could be added in later. So what we're gonna need here, well, we have that ID called floats. Let's give it a background color so we can spot it. Background color sky blue, which in this case is just to identify where it is. Same, we get the same effect from a red line around the end. Thing that's not going to be part of the final style on the page, but it really helps us it's helpful if we can see where things are when we're putting it together. So now we need to split up these words. There was 2 different sections, each one had 3 paragraphs in it. But from what we're looking at here, looks like they just go in order. So I'm gonna throw some colors on there. Background colors kind of the same way to identify them. So we had a class called float top. Background color, I don't know, some off-white thing. D2. Then there was a float left. And a float right. So nothing we haven't seen before yet. Just setting up some identifiers on this. But for some reason, I decided to do it as colors. More often than not, I'll do that as a border. It's just a red border that can be commented out when we don't want to see it. That helps to identify where everything is. What's a good background color for that? Orange. And a float bottom. Background color of I don't know, brown. Let's see what that looks like. Why did those not change colors? Oh, or maybe it doesn't know what border screen is. Or maybe that was supposed to have a dash in it or something. Well, that's weird. Do those things just not have any space to them? It should be there. Oh, I made a typo. Those are supposed to be underscores, not dashes. Actually, this probably should have been dashes. That would match CSS a whole lot better, but this file was open, so that seems the quicker one to change. There we go. That way we can tell at a glance what section is what. So now it looks a little bit different. It's like, okay, there's our different sections. Something seems a touch off about it. So your first instinct might be just to, well, maybe if they were narrower, it would work. So maybe that left and right side, we can try that. Set our width to say 40%. And same thing on this one. Made them narrower, and it's 40%. So 40 plus 40 is definitely less than 100%. 80% should fit on there. So we need a little bit more than just making them narrow enough to fit beside each other. So the easiest way to do it, or actually there's a really nice way to do it. Yeah, I guess easy might be a good way to describe it, is we can use the command float. We'll change how it lays out on the page. Float is how the stuff goes. And why I erased that line up, that attribute over here that said the direction was left or right, because we can change that. We can say float this to the left. You'll at least notice some of the margins changed and stuff. Something looks different. And the reason it's still in columns though, is because the other one's back to the stuff that should be floated right, the orange stuff there, is back to the default. So it just goes in order. So we do have to explicitly say that we want this other one floated left as well. And flow might have been a better word for that. Instead of float, because now it flows left to right. Oh, and it's stuck that other stuff in there. I'll change this to right real quick, just so you can see what that does. Notice when we said left, that first one, the one on the top went to the left, and the orange one in the middle. And if we flow from the right, it kind of reverses it. And at that point, we had columns, so the browser looked at it and it's like, oh, well, this other stuff will fit in here. So probably need to split that up. And switch it back to the left and right. And, oops. Oh, right click, there we go. So it flows. The word float actually defines the flow. So it either flows left to right or flows right to left. And the direction we put there is the direction it's flowing from. So I'm going to go the normal American left to right, top to bottom, left to right. I'll keep the code somewhat organized. When the computer saw that, it's like, well, there's still, we had 80%, so there's still 20% of the page left. I can put that bottom paragraph in there. So we might also need to clear our floating areas. We can say when it's clear on the left. Notice I floated everything to the left. We can float some stuff to the left and some stuff to the right. I'm gonna do that after one more change. Didn't really get any margins, but I moved it down. Started to match our thing. So floating gets us those positions. And sometimes when I'm putting pages together, doing lots of floats, I find it easier, especially if it's going to be two column things, is to actually set one of them as floating on the left, the other one floating on the right. Easier to keep track of. But then there's something we need to watch out for. In this case, it still looks just like it did before. But maybe that right-hand column, if that was longer, I'll come over here and hit Control-Shift-D and duplicate this a few times. Then we start to get a little bit of overflow unnecessarily. So a better option to put when we clear our CSS out, or to clear the floats, is we can clear both. And that's all great keywords we have. Float can be left and right. Then clear, we want to know when it's clear on the left, or when it's clear, the stuff floated right is clear. Or we can just say both, just to make sure that it's clear on both sides. And start to get those little columns. So just some positioning things. And then we can apply all those other styles that we've already seen instead of just generic background colors to tell what shape is which. So that's floating. That's floating point, I think, is the easiest, especially if you're going to have a lot of multiple screens sizes. That's my preference for things like mobile apps and stuff. For those who have started on the homework for this week, well, it uses media queries for different sizes. Personally, I like to just float stuff and maybe adjust text sizes if necessary with a media query. I find it easier to work with and just set everything as percentages. And that way, all the stuff is still somewhat relative to itself, unless it be like really, really small on the phone screen. Oh, speaking of that, whenever I got the assignment for different screen sizes, when I grade that, I have a 5.5 inch phone, Motorola, but I don't think the size matters. I don't think the type matters for it. But if I have a 5.5 inch phone and an 8-inch tablet and my laptop that I'll be grading those on, if you want to check and make sure it works all right on all appropriate devices. Let's see, anything else in the notes? Set up our widths, whatever we want them to be. Any of our numbers, I just do 40%, but we've seen lots of ways to set sizes now. And we've got a lot to cover. That's stuff to do in live time. Just play around, make little changes to that floating things and the shadows and overlaps, and look for some styling features, layout features you like. Yeah, I've read through these notes a couple times. I think I talked about all of them when I was doing that. So in this case, one thing to note is it is stripped down, very minimal here, right? We just put in some colors to identify our different elements. And randomly fill the space with words. But when actual programs start to get big, we have to start worrying about interaction a little bit more. One more thing that we have to worry about, variable type of interaction between the cascading style sheets properties. It might make it a little odd to test with. We might want more precise control. Things might start affecting each other, right? Like we saw just a moment ago, we had 40% on those things that needed to put in columns. The computer just went ahead and used that other 20%, even though we didn't tell it to have stuff floating. So the cascading from the CSS. Those properties can flow on down through the encoding and affect other elements as well. So sometimes it can be nice to just take absolute control over it. I guess that'll be our next option. So I'll just copy those words essentially. So I'll come back over to the HTML and do the same thing with absolute position. So I'll copy that whole main tag there. There we go. Copy that. Paste it in here and make a couple changes to identify things. So this will be absolute. Maybe we want to have absolute control over how things are positioned on the page. I'll do the same thing here. I'm going to abbreviate it. Absolute top, absolute left, absolute right, and absolute bottom. So that we can just have absolute control over the positioning here. Which I can just copy this stuff to get the same colors and everything. So I'll copy that. Oops. Add a couple lines. Maybe a comment. It says absolute. I just want to label this one while we're at it. Here and add in a comment that says floats.
Thank you.
And I don't like working at the bottom of the screen, so I'm just going to add a bunch of white space down there. And paste this in and then rename all this stuff. Yeah, this is one thing to keep in mind. Y'all are probably aware, if you weren't already aware, you double click on a word to highlight just that word. But notice that that behaves differently from a dash than it does from an underscore. It's like a dash separates words for that double click highlight, whereas an underscore still counts as the same word. So using dashes, especially in CSS where we use them all the time anyway, can be a little bit better for that quick selection if we're going to do copy and paste in like this. And ABS button. So I'm going to do clear here. Get rid of these floats. The width will be okay. We get some sort of background. So on the top, we need a way to position that absolutely. So maybe position. Our keyword is absolute. We'll see that in the next three things. I'm going to use fixed here. So one of the things we do is fixed. Or I'll come back and do that. Show what fixed does in a moment. So I'll set the left and right as absolute. So if we set our position property to the value absolute, It still kind of looks like it did earlier. Maybe on the one on the right. Oops. I'll add a position. Say we're going to use absolute positioning. And well, there's another line we need. I'll reload this. See this change. Things all started to flow kind of odd there, didn't they? And if you noticed earlier, whenever there was some extra space on the right and the computer put it in there, it showed all of the words. We're only seeing the last couple words here because it is behind those things we're looking at. Just one thing, if we use absolute positioning, that's one of the ones that allows us to access what's called the Z index, which is how close or farther away it is. So if we set this to say 5, you can see that brings positive numbers, bring that like out of the screen. Brought that one that was in the back up to the front. Or if we set it to say maybe this to -5, oops, that to -5, and this one we can give it a Z index of -15. Send it to the back, and then we can see that whole thing that's supposed to be the footer again. But notice it just completely overlaps. That's one thing about absolute positioning, is once you start using absolute positioning, you have to stick with it. Once things are positioned absolutely, you have to stick with them. Yeah, we can see the whole thing here. If we look over here, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There are 12 lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we can see it's sitting directly behind that green one. We just said absolute positioning. So everything just got the next position. So what we have to do is move it relative to something that we know. So like this one for the bottom here, we could say left and adjust it somewhere from the left, maybe 12 EM, 12 characters over. That's probably not enough at all. And see, then it starts moving over. And we start positioning things, get really nice overlapping. The downside of the absolute positioning is that point I just mentioned, that once you start using absolute positioning, you have to stick with it. The computer will not take back control. So our other methods we just kind of give nudges and then the computer fills in all the gaps. So we have to explicitly state everything here. And anytime, then whenever you make changes, there's a good chance you'll have to update those again. Maybe 24 characters over. Still not quite enough. 48. All right, I moved it at least all the way past it. And then that bottom one, well, once you start using absolute positioning, you have to stick with it. Every CSS selector afterwards needs to start with that position absolute once you use it once. Well, there's a slight variance, which I was going to put on the top line. We can also fix stuff. And this one needs offset from the top by, I don't know, maybe 14 lines. Let's see where that gets us. Way up here. So notice that if it said offset by from the top 14, it went up instead of down. So we need a negative 14 to go down there, which can get a little confusing because I think we've already seen some stuff. In general, web pages measure from the top and our Y numbers increase as we go down. But that's not necessarily consistent because we just saw here that it's a negative number that increases on the way down. I have no idea where it went to. The scroll bar doesn't seem to get all the way down to it. Oh. Oh, I know what happened. I was thinking of the bottom. I'm not really. Never mind about what I just said. I was thinking about that I was adjusting it from the bottom, but I did say top. So we're 14 lines from the top of the page. We need to be way further down the page to get past all of that stuff. Yeah, top positive numbers go down, bottom positive numbers go up, but it changes. When you play around with it a lifetime, you will see the little differences, but absolute positioning has some definite disadvantages to it. That's not nearly enough. So maybe 55 lines. And using EM units for something like this is kind of nice because then it's how many lines of the page are we going down? Now I can see that we need to go down 3 more lines. Maybe 4 more to get a little space. I'll just go ahead and jump that up to 60. There we go. So now we're almost below that stuff. 63. You get this extra space below. There we go. I'll leave the things out on the page and at first you might think absolute position sounds really nice because we have control over it. But most people prefer not to use it unless there's a really good reason to, because once you take that control, you have to keep that control. The computer won't, you can't give the control of layouts back to the computer after you position one thing absolutely. Which means there's going to be a lot more work. Because, well, this is a stripped down, as stripped down as I could make this example. So there's only 4 things here. Most of our websites have more than 4 things on them, right? Which means there's a whole lot of putting that instructions for the absolute positioning in. That's going to be fixed. Another one that goes with absolute positioning. I'll come up here to this top one. Is fixed. And that's the ones that it stays in place. Oh, let me change the words on the HTML so we can see which one that is. Absolute and fixed stuff. So you can see, as far as layout, left to right, top to bottom, it still goes underneath all the elements above it in the HTML. But when I start scrolling, it stays in that position. Those can be really, really useful. Unlike the other absolute positioning, that one is used quite often, especially for like the back to top buttons. Those links that jump back up to the top of the page. That can be incredibly useful. But notice that it got all that overlap with the absolute positioning, so we need to move things down a little. So I guess all this stuff needs to come down some from the top. So from the top, and 31 lines, let's see where that puts that. Oh, I moved it up further than that. 39 lines. There we go, put it under there. Other column will work all right. It's not as quite as overlapped until we start scrolling. I'm gonna take that line out. But you see where the fixed thing is, especially for the links that go back to the top of the page. That is very, very useful. So I'm gonna make that one of those links. How do we get to the top of the page? Up here at the very top, there's an ID already. And we've seen anchor tags where we can use a hyperlink reference, which refers to something on the internet somewhere. And the anchor tag will connect us to that spot. It refers anchors to something somewhere, and the file we're creating right here is something somewhere. So we can anchor to another spot in the same file, or a particular spot in another file. But this is right up at the top. We have to use the ID for it. But when we do an anchor tag, so on that fixed one, I'm gonna make that a back to top link. Paragraph, I'll put in an anchor tag and just say back to top. And the anchor tag in the paragraph. And our hyperlink reference here links to an ID. And the same way we ask for an ID in CSS, we will ask for here. The hashtag, I guess, and whatever the name of that one was, float top. Now as we scroll, there's got this link. It should take us to the back to the top of the page. Why didn't it take us to the top of the page? Did I make a typo there? Let me check my example here that I pulled up before I get too distracted. Oh, oh. I went to a class instead of things. Sorry. It has to go to an ID, and the ID is on our main tag, which is way up at the top. So the ID is floats, and float top was a class. There we go. Save that. And give that a try. So now if I scroll down, there we go. So now the back to the top button takes us all the way back to the top of the page. And no matter how far down we scroll, we have that link there handy. So the fixed positioning is used quite often for that, especially if the page is going to be really, really long. So typically at the very bottom, not just hanging out in the middle like I have there. And those hyperlinks can kind of go the other way as well, down the page. So Here's some words halfway down the page. Right now, they're at the very bottom of the page, but soon they'll be, we're gonna add stuff after this too, so. We can give that paragraph an ID. I'll call it midway. And then up at the top somewhere, we can set up a hyperlink reference to go midway down the page. So like in the first paragraph. Here are some words that link halfway down the page. Close the anchor tag. Then come back over here and open an anchor tag with a reference to that midway. And it's an ID, so we do need that hashtag. Eventually, as you learn other languages that are involved in full stack development, you'll find that anytime we have an ID, we're going to use the hashtag to refer to it. In all of our full stack languages, the standards at least. Now if I reload that, we have this link. Oh, that does not look good next to the green, but and click it, it gets us halfway down the page, and then the back to the top page and gets right back up to the beginning. It's a very useful one. I put off talking about that until we got to this example because this example has a lot more scrolling involved than some of our others, so we can really see those links go. But you just have to reference an ID. So if you've ever done that, like you find something on a forum that you want to refer to, you don't want somebody that you're going to send the link to go to the top of the forum and have to scroll all the way down, where you like roughly describe it. So you highlight it, right click, and create the link there. And then it gives you some big messy looking thing. If there's an ID to that already, it'll use that, but there's probably not an ID to most of the paragraphs out there on the internet. So the computer just makes one. It's like, okay, this paragraph needs explicitly called something, and then it gets a computer number, and we see usually the base 64 encoding of whatever the computer decided to call it. That's whenever there's a really, really long binary string, we take the bits, 6 bits at a time, and encode it with 64 characters. It's a very common thing for things like paragraphs on the internet. The computers themselves are going to randomly generate an ID for, or image data where there's a lot of binary stuff a human might need to look at or work with. And we need 64 characters. So we have our 10 digits. Then we have the alphabet, just like we did with hex, but we only needed a couple more letters for hex. So it starts with the uppercase ones. So 10 digits, uppercase letters gives us 36, plus the lowercase ones. So another 26 gets us up to 62. So then we need 2 more characters. And there's no consistency on what the last 2 characters are for the base 64 encoding, but you should be able to figure it out pretty quick if you just look at some base 64 encoding, see what characters aren't a digit, followed by a capital letter, followed by lowercase letters, and then whatever symbols are left will go left to right on the keyboard, left to right, top to bottom. So whichever one is the top leftmost key on your keyboard will go first, and the shift key gets priority. So like if you look and find that it looks like plus and equals were the last 2 symbols used for base 64 encoding, then well, we covered 0 to 61, so then number 62 would be the plus, right? Yeah, the plus sign, because the shift key gets priority. And then the equal sign would be number 63. So whenever we see base 64 encoding, it's only those last 2 symbols we have to check on. And it's kind of inconsistent, but whatever's the top leftmost key is the one that will work. that comes first. Okay, so there's those links. What other types of layouts could we have? Back over to this example. So that floats, absolute. Oh, relative position is similar to absolute positioning, but not as exact, not as precise. So I'll copy that stuff once again and look at the next numbers. This whole main section. Same one I copied last time is from the floats. I'll come after the absolute positioning stuff and paste that in and change this to look at relative positioning. Relative top, ID equals relative. And we could put another link down here to the bottom of the page. I think our plan was to do that, but it follows the same suit. We just put a unique ID in the paragraph somewhere. Oh, that's in the link. I'll take that link I copied. So now this stuff, I'll be below all that. Yeah, we're right on top of it. I'm going to comment out that relative position, absolute positioning section. Is like I mentioned, once we start with absolute positioning, we have to keep using absolute positioning. Control / on most text editors should turn those off, or should comment words out. I'll do the same thing up here. Notice once again, Control / it's a different language, but it still comments it out. /, the one where the bottom part is to the left. It starts backwards and moves forward. Moves up. Yeah, the back and /, it's the top of the line we go to. So / has the top part and coming down, and the / goes up to it. Let's get that absolute positioning stuff out of the way because it can cause problems. There we go. Now we got some relative positioning things that we can set up, which are similar to absolute positioning, but they won't cause quite as many problems as the absolute stuff. So once again, I'll copy all this stuff. I might as well copy the label while I'm at it. And paste that in. And then all this was relative now. And we don't need any of the float properties. Take that out, make that relative. And for those who have done this week's homework, probably noticing that the style sheets might be starting to seem to get a little bit long. But there's a lot of repetitiveness in that getting long. So copy and paste is a very, very useful thing. Keep copy and paste in mind and minimize the amount of typing you do. Humans are the ones that make typos, machines never do. So copy and paste is good. Copy, paste, and adjust is generally a better method. So now for our relative positioning, I'll leave the top where it is. And once again, we use the position attribute or property and just say we want to use relative positioning. I'll do that on both the left and right. And it is relative to the thing above it in the HTML code. So once we start moving things all over the place, it gets might get a little bit tricky to remember what we're relative to. So if you need to go back and figure out what you're relative to, go back to the HTML code, and it's relative to the previous thing. So this section is positioned relative to this section, which is positioned relative to this section. And a little bit of wiggle room, which you'll figure out the adjustments very, very quickly when you try making a couple changes at lab time today. Relative position is a lot more popular than absolute positioning because we take back a lot of the control, but the computer still has quite a bit of it. Yeah. So right now, it just kind of fell in place like it was. I haven't really done anything that said use relative positioning on this. I think I did, and then get a typo in there. But we need some rules for it. And I got to change this word so I can tell what's what. After copying it, this should say relative stuff. Just because that was one of the words on the page that actually worked as an identifier. And what we want to do is just set up those top and left positions just like we did before. So maybe top, set that to 2EN. So it's a little bit further below that other one. We notice it went behind that. So once again, with relative positioning, we do have that Z index we can use again. So like Z index of something positive. And the more positive it is, the further towards the screen it is. And the more negative it is, the further away it is. You just want something to kind of set layers for overlaps and stuff like that. We can throw in a positive number and bring that forward. All the way up and to the point that the computer runs out of room with the 32-bit image. So a really, really big Z index. You could probably it's very unlikely to ever need one that big. You do things like 1, 2, 3, come in and out. A little bit of control over it. I'll set this other one to kind of line up with that. So at the top, again, at 2EM below the thing above it. So the first line starts 2 lines above the thing above it. And you notice some overlap. Something that might seem a little inconsistent. Both of them say two lines below the thing above. But one of those 2 lines is a lot bigger than the other 2 lines, right? It looks at the thing above. So since the thing above is a header, there's enough room for another header, and then it starts again. Whereas on the next one, that really only looks like 1 line, but sometimes CSS will do funny things. I'm pretty sure that's 1 line, not 2, however we look at it. But above the other one, there's enough space for 2 headers. And here, there's enough space for those to be 2. that is clearly only one line. CSS will get a little bit funny like that. And we sat down and did the calculation. We could figure out why that only did one line instead of two. But it's kind of a complicated calculation. So pretty much everybody just goes with the trial and error. We would definitely have to have the computer help us with that calculation. At the very least, a nice calculator and a lot of paper. So most people just do a little bit of trial and error. And it's like, oh, well, for some reason that's only doing one line instead of two, and just increase it from there. That's a much, much faster method than the complicated math for predicting CSS. But this one should probably be on the right. So we also want to move it from the left. Notice that after we said our absolute or relative positioning, then it's the side we're going from. And we have all four: top left, bottom right. I didn't use bottom last time. And watch the negative and positive numbers because we're coming from that. And it is explicitly from something. So positive and negative, the meaning, we get some wiggle room in the meaning depending on where we're coming from. Let's say, I don't know, 345 pixels. Oh, actually, I know how wide it is. That one's 40% wide. So if we go 45%, we should be well past it. There we go. But at this point, those columns should line up, right? That's where we get that negative effect. So instead of going down, we might want to go up. Well, 3 elements. There's 3 lines in the other one. Oh, it looks like we need to go up a little further than that. 4. I guess that was counting that as 2. Oh. Some sort of odd number going up. Oh, 5's too much. 4 is not enough. 5's too much. So that must be coming from that extra padding in there in places. So we have either padding or margins between our paragraphs, but not at the top or bottom. So it must be margins, not padding, because we would have padding at the top or bottom. 4.5. That looks like it lines up a little bit better. I think it might still be a little off though. So just adjust the numbers so you get it to the right spot. Take a guess on the first one. Once you see where that is, just make adjustments. And notice the top and bottom, we didn't reposition it. They're still where they were by default. And then that stuff is we set up relative to the thing before it in the HTML. The stuff in green is relative to that one right up the gray box above it. And the stuff in orange is relative to green. So we had to move it from the left, so move it towards the right. But then it was too low, so we had to use negative from the top, a negative amount to make them line up. But the computer still has a lot of control over it. And when we get back to that, I guess I call it a footer section here, the computer's back to taking control, and that's still in the same position it wanted to put that thing by default. So that's a little more popular than the absolute, is we get some of the control back, but we don't have to take all of the control and end up with lots and lots and lots of extra code rate. So that's a number of layout options. We have a couple more. A Procon list. The Pro for absolute positioning On absolute positioning, the obvious pro is it will always look exactly the way you want it to. Because the computer has explicit instructions on where to put everything. The con is it is not responsive to changes in screen size. So this screen here. You can see that this screen is different than my laptop screen. So we hit a problem that, another problem that we need addressed with that absolute positioning text that we took control over. That's the big con most people don't like about those. What else did I have on there? A pro is we know where everything is going to be. The con for that is once we start with absolute positioning, we have to keep with the absolute positioning. And you'll just want to play around with all of those and see what you like, because there's not necessarily just one way we do it. The best way for any particular site is usually a mix of them. When things are a little more complicated than our stripped down trivial example. We have more ways. Next is something new. It was added to CSS in 2017 is when it was added to the HTML5 standards. Our textbook just added a chapter on that last fall. It takes textbooks a minute to do stuff, so it took the textbook 5 years after it became part of the standard to include it. But it looks like it's time for a break. So before we look at those next, some updated versions, all those we just looked at have been around for a long time, since the origin of CSS, which was way, way, way before it became a standard. So those have been around for a long time. There's some updated versions, became part of the standard, 2016, 2017. I just had the note with the year wrote down in front of me. I forgot what it was. Well, it was 5 years from last year, 2016. 5 years before last year when the textbook finally had it. But it's probably time for a break. It's 10 minutes hungry to everybody. Anybody?
Sounds good.
So this clock here on my desk here says 2:20. So we will get back to it at 2:30. I'll see y'all in just a moment. I'm gonna grab a drink. Get some Mountain Dew somewhere.